From Susie's biography of me.
Mamma and Papa have returned from Onteora, and they have had a delightful visit. Mr. Frank Stockton was down in Virginia and could not reach Onteora in time, so they did not see him, and Mrs. Mary Mapes Dodge was ill and couldn't go to Onteora. But Mrs. General Custer was there, and Mamma said that she was a very attractive, sweet-appearing woman.
Dictated October 9th, 1906. Onteora was situated high up in the Catskill Mountains in the center of a far-reaching solitude. I do not mean that the region was wholly uninhabited. There were farmhouses here and there at generous distances apart. Their occupants were descendants of ancestors who had built the houses in Rip Van Winkle's time or earlier, and those ancestors were not more primitive than were this posterity of theirs. The city people were as foreign and unfamiliar and strange to them as monkeys would have been, and they would have respected the monkeys as much as they respected these elegant summer resorters. The resorters were a puzzle to them. Their ways were so strange and their interests so trivial. They drove the resorters over the mountain roads and listened in shamed surprise at their bursts of enthusiasm over the scenery. The farmers had had that scenery on exhibition from their mountain roosts all their lives, and had never noticed anything remarkable about it. By way of an incident, a pair of these primitives were overheard chatting about the resorters one day, and in the course of their talk, this remark was dropped. "I was a-driving a passel of 'em around yesterday evening, quiet ones, you know, still and solemn, and all to once they busted out to making your hair lift, and I judged hell was to pay. Now what do you reckon it was? It wasn't anything but just one of them common damn yaller sunsets." In those days, Warner is gone, Stockton is gone. I attended both funerals. Warner was a near neighbor from the autumn of '71 until his death 19 years afterward. It is not the privilege of most of us to have many intimate friends. A dozen is our aggregate, but I think he could count his by the score. It is seldom that a man is so beloved by both sexes and all ages as Warner was. There was a charm about his spirit, and his ways, and his words, that won all that came within the sphere of its influence. Our children adopted him while they were little creatures, and thenceforth to the end he was Cousin Charlie to them. He was Uncle Charlie to the children of more than one other friend. Mrs. Clemens was very fond of him, and he always called her by her first name, shortened. Warner died, as she died, and I would die, without premonition, without a moment's warning. Uncle Remus still lives, and must be over 1,000 years old. Indeed, I know that this must be so because I have seen a new photograph of him in the public prints within the last month or so, and in that picture his aspects are distinctly and strikingly geological, and one can see he is thinking about the mastodons and plesiosaurians that he used to play with when he was young. It is just a quarter of a century since I have seen Uncle Remus. He visited us in our home in Hartford and was reverently devoured by the big eyes of Susie and Clara. For I made a deep and awful impression upon the little creatures, who knew his book by heart through my nightly declamation of its tales to them, by revealing to them privately that he was the real Uncle Remus, whitewashed so that he could come into people's houses the front way. He was the bashfulest grown person I have ever met. When there were people about, he stayed silent, and seemed to suffer until they were gone. But he was lovely, nevertheless, for the sweetness and benignity of the immortal Remus looked out from his eyes, and the graces and sincerities of his character shone in his face. It may be that Jim Wolfe was as bashful as Harris. It hardly seems possible, yet as I looked back 56 years and considered Jim Wolfe, I am almost persuaded that he was. He was our long, slim apprentice in my brother's printing office in Hannibal. He was 17, and yet he was as much as 4 times as bashful as I was, though I was only 14. He boarded and slept in the house, but he was always tongue-tied in the presence of my sister, and when even my gentle mother spoke to him, he could not answer save in frightened monosyllables. He would not enter a room where a girl was. Nothing could persuade him to do such a thing. Once, when he was in our small parlor alone, 2 majestic old maids entered and seated themselves in such a way that Jim could not escape without passing by them. He would as soon have thought of passing by one of Harris's plesiosaurians 90 feet long. I came in presently, was charmed with this situation, and sat down in a corner to watch Jim suffer, and enjoy it. My mother followed a minute later and sat down with the visitors and began to talk. Jim sat upright in his chair, and during a quarter of an hour he did not change his position by a shade. Neither General Grant nor a bronze image could have maintained that immovable pose more successfully. I mean as to body and limbs. With the face there was a difference. By fleeting revealments of the face I saw that something was happening, something out of the common. There would be a sudden twitch of the muscles of the face, an instant distortion, which in the next instant had passed and left no trace. These twitches gradually grew in frequency, but no muscle outside of the face lost any of its rigidity or betrayed any interest in what was happening to Jim. I mean, if something was happening to Jim, and I knew perfectly well that that was the case. At last, a pair of tears began to swim slowly down his cheeks amongst the twitchings, but Jim sat still and let them run. Then I saw his right hand steal along his thigh until halfway to his knee, then take a vigorous grip upon the cloth. That was a wasp he was grabbing. A colony of them were crawling up his legs and prospecting around, and every time he winced they stabbed him to the hilt. So for a quarter of an hour, one group of excursionists after another climbed up Jim's legs and resented even the slightest wince or squirm that he indulged himself with in his misery. When the entertainment had become nearly unbearable, he conceived the idea of gripping them between his fingers and putting them out of commission. He succeeded with many of them, but at a great cost. For as he couldn't see the wasp, he was as likely to take hold of the wrong end of him as he was the right. Then the dying wasp gave him a punch to remember the incident by. If those ladies had stayed all day, and if all the wasps in Missouri had come and climbed up Jim's legs, nobody there would ever have known it but Jim and the wasps and me. There he would have sat until the ladies left. When they finally went away, we went upstairs and he took his clothes off, and his legs were a picture to look at. They looked as if they were mailed all over with shirt buttons, each with a single red hole in the center. The pain was intolerable. No, would have been intolerable, but the pain of the presence of those ladies had been so much harder to bear that the pain of the wasp stings was quite pleasant and enjoyable by comparison. Jim never could enjoy wasps. I remember once, from Susie's biography of me.
Mama has given me a very pleasant little newspaper scrap about Papa to copy. I will put it in here.
Thursday, October 11th, 1906. It was a rather strong compliment. I think I will leave it out. It was from James Redpath. The chief ingredients of Redpath's makeup were honesty, sincerity, kindliness, and pluck. He wasn't afraid. He was one of Osawatomie Brown's right-hand men in the Bleeding Kansas days. He was all through that struggle. He carried his life in his hands, and from one day to another, it wasn't worth the piece of a night's lodging. He had a small body of daring men under him, and they were constantly being hunted by the Jayhawkers, who were pro-slavery Missourians, guerrillas, modern freelancers. Friday, October 12, 1906. I can't think of the name of that daredevil guerrilla who led the Jayhawkers and chased Redpath up and down the country, and in turn was chased by Redpath. By grace of the chances of war, the two men never met in the field, though they several times came within an ace of it. 10 or 12 years later, Redpath was earning his living in Boston as chief of the lecture business in the United States. 15 or 16 years after his Kansas adventures, I became a public lecturer, and he was my agent. Along there somewhere was a press dinner one November night at the Tremont Hotel in Boston, and I attended it. I sat near the head of the table, with Redpath between me and the chairman. A stranger sat on my other side. I tried several times to talk with the stranger, but he seemed to be out of words, and I presently ceased from troubling him. He was manifestly a very shy man, and moreover, he might have been losing sleep the night before. The first man called up was Redpath. At the mention of the name, the stranger started and showed interest. He fixed a fascinated eye on Redpath, and lost not a word of his speech. Redpath told some stirring incidents of his career in Kansas, and said, among other times, 3 times I came near capturing the gallant Jayhawker chief, and once he actually captured me, but didn't know me and let me go, because he said he was hot on Redpath's trail and could not afford to waste time and rope on inconsequential small fry. My stranger was called up next, and when Redpath heard his name, he, in turn, showed a startled interest. The stranger said, bending a caressing glance upon Redpath and speaking gently, I may even say sweetly, "You realize that I was the Jayhawker chief. I am glad to know you now, and to take to my heart and call you friend." Then he added, in a voice that was pathetic with regret, "But if I had only known you then, what tumultuous happiness I should have had in your society," while it lasted. Howdy, Bricken. The last quarter of a century of my life has been pretty constantly and faithfully devoted to the study of the human race. That is to say, the study of myself, for in my individual person, I am the entire human race compacted together. I have found that then is no ingredient of the race which I do not possess in either a small way or a large way. When it is small, as compared with the same ingredient in somebody else, there is still enough of it for all the purposes of examination. In my contacts with the species, I find no one who possesses a quality which I do not possess. The shades of difference between other people and me serve to make variety and prevent monotony. But that is all. Broadly speaking, we are all alike, and so, by studying myself carefully and comparing myself with other people and noting the divergences, I have been enabled to acquire a knowledge of the human race which I perceive is more accurate and more comprehensive than that which has been acquired and revealed by any other member of our species. As a result, my private and concealed opinion of myself is not of a complimentary sort. It follows that my estimate of the human race is the duplicate of my estimate of myself. I am not proposing to discuss all the peculiarities of the human race at this time. I only wish to touch lightly upon 1 or 2 of them. To begin with, I wonder why a man should prefer a good billiard table to a poor one, and why he should prefer straight cues to crooked ones, and why he should prefer a level table to one that slants and why he should prefer responsive cushions to the dull and unresponsive kind. I wonder at these things because when we examine the matter, we find that the essentials involved in billiards are as completely and exhaustively furnished by a bad billiard outfit as they are by the best one. One of the essentials is amusement. Very well, if there is any more amusement to be gotten out of one of outfit than out of the other, the facts are in favor of the bad outfit. The bad outfit will always furnish 30% more fun for the players and for the spectators than will the good outfit. Another essential of the game is that the outfit shall give the players full opportunity to exercise their best skill and display it in a way to compel the admiration of the spectators. Very well, the bad outfit is nothing behind the good one in this regard. It is a difficult matter to estimate correctly the eccentricities of chipped balls and a slanting table, and make the right allowances for them and secure a count. The finest kind of skill is required to accomplish the satisfactory result. Another essential of the game is that it shall add to the interest of the game by furnishing opportunities to bet. Very well, in this regard, no good outfit can claim any advantage over a bad one. I know by experience that a bad outfit is as valuable as the best one, that an outfit that couldn't be sold at auction for $7 is just as valuable for all the essentials of the game as an outfit that is worth 1,000. I acquired some of this learning in Jackass Gulch, California, more than 40 years ago. Jackass Gulch has once been a rich and thriving surface mining camp. By and by, its gold deposits were exhausted. Then the people began to go away, and the town began to decay and rapidly. In my time, it had disappeared. Where the bank and the city hall and the church and the gambling dens and the newspaper office and the streets of brick blocks had been was nothing now but a wide and beautiful expanse of green grass, a peaceful and charming solitude. Half a dozen scattered dwellings were still inhabited, and there was still one saloon of a ruined and rickety character struggling for life, but doomed. In its bar was a billiard outfit that was the counterpart of the one in my father-in-law's garret. The balls were chipped, the cloth was darned and patched, the table's surface was undulating, and the cues were headless and had the curve of a parenthesis. But the forlorn remnant of marooned miners played games there, and those games were more entertaining to look at than a circus and a grand opera combined. Nothing but a quite extraordinary skill could score a carom on that table, a skill that required the nicest estimate of force, distance, and how much to allow for the various slants of the table and the other formidable peculiarities and idiosyncrasies furnished by the contradictions of the outfit. Last winter, here in New York, I saw Hop and Schaefer and Sutton and the 3 or 4 other billiard champions of worldwide fame contend against each other, and certainly the art and science displayed were a wonder to see. Yet I saw nothing there in the way of science and art that was more wonderful than shots which I had seen in Texas Tom make on the wavy surface of that poor old wreck in the perishing saloon at Jackass Gulch 40 years before. Once I saw Texas Tom make a string of 7 points on a single inning. All calculated shots, and not a fluke or a scratch among them. I often saw him make runs of 4, but when he made his great string of 7, the boys went wild with enthusiasm and admiration. The joy and the noise exceeded that which the great gathering at Madison Square produced when Sutton scored 500 points at the 18-inch game on a world-famous night last winter. With practice, that champion could score 19 or 20 on Jackass Gulch table, but to start with, Texas Tom would show him miracles that would astonish him. Also, it might have another handsome result. It might persuade the great experts to discard their own trifling game and bring the Jackass Gulch outfit here and exhibit their skill in a game worth 100 of the discarded one for profound and breathless interest and for displays of almost superhuman skill. In my experience, games played with a fiendish outfit furnished ecstasies of delight which games played with the other kind cannot match. 27 years ago, my budding little family spent the summer at Bateman's Point, near Newport, Rhode Island. It was a comfortable boarding place, well stocked with sweet mothers and little children, but the male sex was scarce. However, there was another young fellow besides myself, and he and I had good times. Higgins was his name, but that was not his fault. He was a very pleasant and companionable person. On the premises there was what had once been a bowling alley. It was a single alley, and it was estimated that it had been out of repair for 60 years. But not the balls. The balls were in good condition. There were 41 of them, and they ranged in size from a grapefruit up to a lignum vitae sphere that you could hardly lift. Higgins and I played on that alley day after day. At first, one of us located himself at the bottom end to set up the pins in case anything should happen to them. But nothing happened. The surface of that alley consisted of a rolling stretch of elevations and depressions, and neither of us could, by any art known to us, persuade a ball to stay on the alley until it should accomplish something. Little balls and big, the same thing always happened. The ball left the alley before it was halfway home and went thundering down alongside of it the rest of the way and made the gamekeeper climb out and take care of himself. No matter, we persevered and were rewarded. We examined the alley, noted and located a lot of its peculiarities, and little by little we learned how to deliver a ball in such a way that it would travel home and knock down a pin or two. By and by, we succeeded in improving our game to a point where we were able to get all of the pins with 35 balls. So we made it a 35-ball game. If the player did not succeed with 35, he had lost the game. I suppose that all the balls taken together weighed 500 pounds, or maybe a ton, or along there somewhere. But anyway, it was hot weather, and by the time that a player had sent 35 of them home, he was in a drench of perspiration and physically exhausted. Next, we started cocked hat, that is to say, a triangle of 3 pins, the other 7 being discarded. In this game, we used the 3 smallest balls and kept on delivering them until we got the 3 pins down. After a day or 2 of practice, we were able to get the chief pin with an output of 4 balls, but it cost us a great many deliveries to get the other 2. But by and by we succeeded in perfecting our art. At least we perfected it to our limit. We reached a scientific excellence where we could get the 3 pins down with 12 deliveries of the 3 small balls, making 36 shots to conquer the cocked hat. Having reached our limit for daylight work, we set up a couple of candles and played at night. As the alley was 50 or 60 feet long, we couldn't pass the pins, but the candles indicated their locality. We continued this game until we were able to knock down the invisible pins with 36 shots. Having now reached the limit of our candle game, we changed and played it left-handed. We continued the left-handed game until we conquered its limit, which was 54 shots. Sometimes we sent down a succession of 15 balls without getting anything at all. We easily got out of that old alley 5 times the fun that anybody could have gotten out of the best alley in New York. One blazing hot day, a modest and courteous officer of the regular army appeared in our den and introduced himself. He was about 35 years old, well built and militarily erect and straight, and he was hermetically sealed up in the uniform of that ignorant old day, a uniform made of heavy material and much properer for January than July. When he saw the venerable alley and glanced from that to the long procession of shining balls in the trough, his eye lit with desire, and we judged that he was our meat. We politely invited him to take a hand, and he could not conceal his gratitude, though his breeding and the etiquette of his profession made him try. We explained the game to him and said that we were 41 balls, and that the player was privileged to extend his inning and keep on playing until he had used them all up, repeatedly, and that for every 10 strike he got a prize. We didn't name the prize. It wasn't necessary, as no prize would ever be needed or called for. He started a sarcastic smile, but quenched it. According to the etiquette of his profession, he merely remarked that he would like to select a couple of medium balls and one small one, adding that he didn't think he would need the rest. Then he began, and he was an astonished man. He couldn't get a ball to stay on the alley. When he had fired about 15 balls and hadn't yet reached the cluster of pins, his annoyance began to show out through his clothes. He wouldn't let it show in his face, but after another 15 balls he was not able to control his face. He didn't utter a word, but he exuded a mute blasphemy from every pore. He asked permission to take off his coat, which was granted. Then he turned himself loose with bitter determination, and although he was only an infantry officer, he could have been mistaken for a battery. He got up such a volleying thunder with those balls. Presently he removed his cravat, and after a little he took off his vest, and still he went bravely on. Higgins was suffocating. My condition was the same, but it would not be courteous to laugh. It would be better to burst, and we came near it. That officer was good pluck. He stood to his work without uttering a word, and kept the balls going until he had expended the outfit 4 times, making 4 times 41 shots. Then he had to give it up, and he did, for he was no longer able to stand without wobbling. He put on his clothes, bade us a courteous goodbye, invited us to call at the fort, and started away. Then he came back and said, "What is the prize for the 10 strike?" We had to confess that we had not selected it yet. He said, gravely, that he thought there was no occasion for hurry about it. I believe Bateman's Alley was a better one than any other in America. In the matter of the essentials of the game, it compelled skill, it provided opportunity for bets, and if you could get a stranger to do the bowling for you, there was more and wholesomer and delightfuller entertainment to be gotten out of his industries than out of the finest game by the best experts, and played upon the best alley elsewhere in existence. Whew. That was a pretty good chapter, all about games and the playing of them on crappy game services. January 11th, 1906. Answer to a letter received this morning. Dear Mrs. H., I am forever your debtor for reminding me of that curious passage in my life. During the first year or two after it happened, I could not bear to think of it. My pain and shame were so intense, and my sense of having been an imbecile so settled, established, and confirmed, that I drove the episode entirely from my mind. And so, all these 28 or 29 years, I have lived in the conviction that my performance of that time was coarse, vulgar, and destitute of humor. But your suggestion that you and your family found humor in it 28 years ago moved me to look into the matter. So I commissioned a Boston typewriter to delve among the Boston papers of that bygone time and send me a copy of it. It came this morning, and if there is any vulgarity about it, I am not able to discover it. If it isn't innocently and ridiculously funny, I am no judge. I will see to it that you get a copy. Address of Samuel L. Clemens, Mark Twain, from a report of the dinner given by the publishers of the Atlantic Monthly in honor of the 70th anniversary of the birth of John Greenleaf Whittier at the Brunswick Hotel. Boston, December 17th, 1877, as published in the Boston Evening Transcript, December 18th, 1877. Mr. Chairman, this is an occasion peculiarly meet for the digging up of pleasant reminiscences concerning literary folk. Therefore, I will drop lightly into history myself. Standing here on the shore of the Atlantic and contemplating certain of its largest literary billows, I am reminded of a thing which happened to me 13 years ago, when I had just succeeded in stirring up a little Nevadian literary puddle myself, whose spume flakes were beginning to blow thinly California-wards. I started an inspection tramp through the southern mines of California. I was callow and conceited, and I resolved to try the virtue of my nom de guerre. I very soon had an opportunity. I knocked at a miner's lonely log cabin in the foothills of the Sierras just at nightfall. It was snowing at the time. A jaded, melancholy man of 50, barefooted, opened the door to me. When he heard my nom de guerre, he looked more dejected than before. He let me in, pretty reluctantly, I thought, and after the customary bacon and beans, black coffee, and hot whiskey, I took a pipe. This sorrowful man had said not 3 words up to this time. Now he spoke up and said in the voice of one who is secretly suffering, "You're the 4th. I'm going to move." "The 4th what?" said I. "The 4th literary man that has been here in 24 hours. I'm going to move." "You don't tell me," I said. "Who were the others?" "Mr. Longfellow, Mr. Emerson, and Mr. Oliver Wendell Holmes. Consound the lot." You can easily believe I was interested. I supplicated. 3 hot whiskeys did the rest. And finally, the melancholy miner began. He said, "They came here just at dark yesterday evening, and I let them in, of course. Said they were going to Yosemite. They were a rough lot, but that's nothing. Everybody looks rough that travels afoot. Mr. Emerson was a seedy little bit of a chap, red-headed. Mr. Holmes was as fat as a balloon. He weighed as much as 300, and double chins all the way down to his stomach. Mr. Longfellow built like a prize fighter. His head was cropped and bristly, like as if he had a wig made of hairbrushes. His nose lay straight down his face, like a finger, with the end joint tilted up. They had been drinking, I could see that, and what queer talk they used. Mr. Holmes inspected this cabin. Then he took me by the buttonhole, and says he, 'Through the deep cares of thought, I hear a voice that sings, "Build thee more stately mansions, O my soul." Says I can't afford it, Mr. Holmes, and moreover, I don't want to. Blamed if I liked it pretty well either way, coming from a stranger that way. However, I started to get out my bacon and beans when Mr. Emerson came and looked on a while, and then he takes me aside by the buttonhole and says, "Give me agates for my meat. Give me cantharids to eat. From air and ocean bring me foods, from all zones and altitudes." Says I, "Mr. Emerson, if you'll excuse me, this ain't no hotel." You see, it sort of riled me. I warn't used to the ways of literary swells, but I went on a-sweating over my work, and next comes Mr. Longfellow, and buttonholes me, and interrupts me. Says he, "Honor be to Mudjekeewis. You hear how paw-paw-keewis." But I broke in, and says I, "Beg your pardon, Mr. Longfellow, if you'll be so kind as to hold your yawp for about 5 minutes and let me get this grub ready, you'll do me proud." Well, sir, after they'd filled up, I set out the jug. Mr. Holmes looks at it, and then he fires up all of a sudden and yells, "Flash out a stream of blood-red wine, for I would drink to other days." By George, I was getting kind of worked up. I don't deny it. I was getting kind of worked up.
I turns to Mr. Holmes, and says I, "Looky here, my fat friend, I'm a-running this shanty, and if the court knows herself, you'll take whiskey straight or you'll go dry." Them's the very words I said to him. Now I don't want to pass such famous literary people, but you see they kind of forced me. There ain't nothing unreasonable about me. I don't mind a passel of guests a-treading on my tail 3 or 4 times, but when it comes to standing on it, it's different. And if the court knows herself, says I, you'll take whiskey straight or you'll go dry. Well, between drinks they'd swell around the cabin and strike attitudes and spout. And pretty soon they got out a greasy old deck and went to playing euchre at 10 cents a corner. On trust, I began to notice some pretty suspicious things. Mr. Emerson looked at his hand, shook his head, and says, "I am the doubter and the doubt," and calmly bunched the hands and went to shuffling for a new layout, says he. "They reckon ill who leave me out. They know not well the subtle ways I keep. I pass and deal again." Hanged if he didn't go ahead and do it, too. Oh, he was a cool one. Well, in about a minute, things were running pretty tight, but all of a sudden, I see by Mr. Emerson's eye he judged he had 'em. He had already controlled 2 ticks, and each of the others 1. So now he kind of lifts a little in his chair and says, "I tire of globes and aces. Too long the game is played." And down he fetched a right bower. Mr. Longfellow smiles as sweet as pie and says, Thanks to thee, my worthy friend, for the lesson thou hast taught." And blamed if he didn't down with another right bower. Emerson claps his hand on his bowie, Longfellow claps his on his revolver, and I went under a bunk. There was going to be trouble, but that monstrous Holmes rose up, wobbling his double chins, and says he, "Order, gentlemen, the first man that draws, I'll lay down on him and smother him. All quiet on the Potomac, you bet." They were pretty how come you so by now, and they begun to blow. Emerson says, "The nobliest thing I ever wrote was Barbara Frietchie." Says Longfellow, "It don't begin with my Biglow Papers." Says Holmes, "My Thanatopoulos lays them both over. They mighty near ended in a fight. Then they wished they had some more company." And Mr. Emerson pointed to me and says, "Is yonder squalid peasant all that this pound nursery could breed?" He was a-wetting his bowie on his boot, so I let it pass. Well, sir, next they took it into their heads that they would like some music. So they made me stand up and sing "When Johnny Comes Marching Home" till I dropped. At 13 minutes past 4 this morning. That's what I've been through, my friend. When I woke at 7, they were leaving, thank goodness, and Mr. Longfellow had only my boots on, and under his arm. Says I, "Hold on there, Evangeline, what are you going to do with them?" He says, "Going to make tracks with them because lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing leave behind us footprints on the sands of time." And I said, "Mr. Twain, you are the 4th in 24 hours, and I'm going to move. I ain't suited to a literary atmosphere."
I said to the miner, "Why, my dear sir, these were not the gracious singers to whom we and the world pay loving reverence and homage. These were impostors." The miner investigated me with a calm eye for a while, then said, "Ah, impostors were they? Are you?" I did not pursue the subject, and since then I have not traveled on my nom de guerre enough to hurt. Such was the reminiscence I was moved to contribute. Mr. Chairman, in my enthusiasm, I may have exaggerated the details a little. But you will easily forgive me that fault, since I believe it is the first time I have ever deflected from perpendicular fact on an occasion like this. What I have said to Mrs. H. is true. I did suffer during a year or 2 from the deep humiliations of that episode, but at last, in 1888, in Venice, my wife and I came across Mr. and Mrs. A.P.C. of Concord, Massachusetts, and a friendship began then of the sort which nothing but death terminates. The C's were very bright people, and in every way charming and companionable. We were together a month or two in Venice and several months in Rome afterwards, and one day that lamented break of mine was mentioned. And when I was on the point of lathering those people for bringing it to my mind when I had gotten the memory of it almost squelched, I perceived with joy that the seas were indignant about the way that my performance had been received in Boston. They poured out their opinions most freely and frankly about the frosty attitude of the people who were present at that performance, and about the Boston newspapers for the position they had taken in regard to the matter. That position was that I had been irreverent beyond belief, beyond imagination. Very well, I had accepted that as a fact for a year or two, and had been thoroughly miserable about it whenever I thought of it, which was not frequently, if I could help it. Whenever I thought of it, I wondered how I ever could have been inspired to do so unholy a thing. Well, the seas comforted me, but they did not persuade me to continue to think about the unhappy episode. I resisted that. I tried to get it out of my mind and let it die, and I succeeded, until Mrs. H's letter came. It had been a good 25 years since I had thought of that matter, and when she said that the thing was funny, I wondered if possibly she might be right. At any rate, my curiosity was aroused, and I wrote to Boston and got the whole thing copied, as set forth above. I vaguely remember some of the details of that gathering. Dimly, I can see 100 people, no, perhaps 50. Shadowy figures sitting at tables feeding ghosts now to me and nameless forevermore. I don't know who they were, but I can very distinctly see, seated at the grand table and facing the rest of us, Mr. Emerson, supernaturally grave, unsmiling, Mr. Whittier, grave, lovely, his beautiful spirit shining out of his face, Mr. Longfellow with his silken white hair and his benignant face, Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, flashing smiles and affection and all good fellowship everywhere like a rose diamond whose facets are being turned toward the light first one way and then another. A charming man, and always fascinating, whether he was talking or whether he was sitting still, what he would call still, but what would be more or less motion to other people. I can see those figures with entire distinctness across this abyss of time. One other feature is clear. Willie Winter, for these past 1,000 years, dramatic editor of the New York Tribune, and still occupying that high post in his old age, was there. He was much younger then than he is now, and he showed it. It was always a pleasure to me to see Willie Winter at a banquet. During a matter of 20 years, I was seldom at a banquet where Willie Winter was not also present, and where he did not read a charming poem written for the occasion. He did it this time, and it was up to standard, dainty, happy, choicely phrased, and as good to listen to as music, and sounding exactly as if it was pouring unprepared out of the heart and brain. Now, at that point ends all that was pleasurable about that notable celebration of Mr. Whittier's 70th birthday, because I got up at that point and followed Winter, with what I have no doubt I supposed would be the gem of the evening, the gay oration above quoted from the Boston paper. I had written it all out the day before, and had perfectly memorized it, and I stood up there at my genial and happy and self-satisfied ease, and began to deliver it. Those majestic guests, that row of venerable and still active volcanoes, listened, as did everybody else in the house, with attentive interest. Well, I delivered myself of, we'll say, the first 200 words of my speech. I was expecting no returns from that part of the speech, but this was not the case as regarded the rest of it. I arrived now at the dialogue. The old miner said, "You are the fourth. I'm going to move." "The fourth what?" said I. He answered, "The fourth literary man that has been here in 24 hours. I am going to move." "Why don't you tell me," said I, Who were the others?
Mr. Longfellow, Mr. Emerson, Mr. Oliver Wendell Holmes. Can sound a lot.
Now then, the house's attention continued, but the expression of interest in the faces turned to a sort of black frost. I wondered what the trouble was. I didn't know. I went on, but with difficulty. I struggled along and entered upon that miner's fearful description of the bogus Emerson, the bogus Holmes, the bogus Longfellow. Always hoping, but with a gradually perishing hope, that somebody would laugh, or that somebody would at least smile, but nobody did. I didn't know enough to give it up and sit down. I was too new to public speaking, and so I went on with this awful performance, and carried it clear through to the end, in front of a body of people who seemed turned to stone with horror. It was the sort of expression their faces would have worn if I had been making these remarks about the deity and the rest of the Trinity, and there is no milder way in which to describe the petrified condition and the ghastly expression of those people. When I sat down, it was with a heart which had long ceased to beat. I shall never be as dead again as I was then. I shall never be as miserable again as I was then. I speak now as one who doesn't know what the condition of things may be in the next world, but in this one I shall never be as wretched again as I was then. Howells, who was near me, tried to say a comforting word, but couldn't get beyond a gasp. There was no use. He understood the whole size of the disaster. He had good intentions, but the words froze before they could get out. It was an atmosphere that would freeze anything. If Benvenuto Cellini's salamander had been in that place, he would not have survived to be put into Cellini's autobiography. There was a frightful pause. There was an awful silence, a desolating silence. Then the next man on the list had to get up. There was no help for it. That was Bishop. Bishop had just burst handsomely upon the world with a most acceptable novel, which had appeared in the Atlantic Monthly, a place which would make any novel respectable and any author noteworthy. In this case, the novel itself was recognized as being, without extraneous help, respectable. Bishop was away up in the public favor, and he was an object of high interest. Consequently, there was a sort of national expectancy in the air. We may say our American millions were standing from Maine to Texas and from Alaska to Florida, holding their breath, their lips parted, their hands ready to applaud when Bishop should get up on that occasion, and for the first time in his life speak in public. It was under these damaging conditions that he got up to make good, as the vulgar say. I had spoken several times before, and that is the reason why I was able to go on without dying in my tracks, as I ought to have done. But Bishop had had no experience. He was facing up those awful deities, facing those other people, those strangers, facing human beings for the first time in his life with a speech to utter. No doubt it was well packed away in his memory. No doubt it was fresh and usable until I had been heard from. I suppose that after that, and under the smothering pall of that dreary silence, it began to waste away and disappear out of his head, like the rags breaking from the edge of a fog. And presently there wasn't any fog left. He didn't go on. He didn't last long. It was not many sentences after his first before he began to hesitate and break and lose his grip and totter and wobble, and at last he slumped down in a limp and mushy pile. Well, the program for the occasion was probably not more than 1/3 finished, but it ended there. Nobody rose. The next man hadn't strength enough to get up, and everybody looked so dazed, so stupefied, paralyzed. It was impossible for anybody to do anything, or even try. Nothing could go on in that strange atmosphere. Howells, mournfully and without words, hitched himself to Bishop and me and supported us out of the room. It was very kind, but he was most generous. He towed us tottering away into some room in that building, and we sat down there. I don't know what my remark was now, but I know the nature of it. It was the kind of remark you make when you know that nothing in the world can help your case. But Howells was honest. He had to say the heartbreaking things he did say. That there was no help for this calamity, this shipwreck, this cataclysm, that this was the most disastrous thing that had ever happened in anybody's history. And then he added, that is, for you, and consider what you have done for Bishop. It is bad enough in your case. You deserve to suffer. You have committed this crime, and you deserve to have all you are going to get. But here is an innocent man. Bishop had never done you any harm, and see what you have done to him. He can never hold up his head again. The world can never look upon Bishop as being a live person. He is a corpse. That is the history of that episode of 28 years ago, which pretty nearly killed me with shame during that first year or two whenever it forced its way into my mind. Now then, I take that speech up and examine it. As I said, it arrived this morning from Boston. I have read it twice, and unless I am an idiot, it hasn't a single defect in it from the first word to the last. It is just as good can be. It is smart. It is saturated with humor. There isn't a suggestion of coarseness or vulgarity in it anywhere. What could have been the matter with that house? It is amazing. It is incredible that they didn't shout with laughter. And those deities the loudest of them all. Could the fault have been with me? Did I lose courage when I saw those great men up there whom I was going to describe in such a strange fashion? If that happened, if I showed doubt, that can account for it. But you can't be successfully funny if you show that you are afraid of it. Well, I can't account for it. But if I had those beloved and reverend old literary immortals back here now on the platform at Carnegie Hall, I would take that same speech, deliver it word for word, and melt them till they'd run all over that stage. Oh, the fault must have been with me. It is not in the speech at all. Dictated October 3rd, 1907. In some ways, I was always honest. Even from my earliest years, I could never bring myself to use money which I had acquired in questionable ways. Many a time I tried, but principle was always stronger than desire. 6 or 8 months ago, Lieutenant General Nelson A. Miles was given a great dinner party in New York, and when he and I were chatting together in the drawing room before going out to dinner, he said, "I've known you as much as 30 years, isn't it?" I said, "Yes, that's about it, I think." He mused a moment or two and then said, "I wonder, we didn't meet in Washington in 1867. You were there at that time, weren't you?" I said, "Yes, but there was a difference. I was not known then. I had not yet begun to bud. I was in obscurity, but you had been adding to your fine Civil War record. You had just come back from your brilliant Indian campaign in the far west, and had been rewarded with a brigadier generalship in the regular army, and everybody was talking about you and praising you. If you had met me, you wouldn't be able to remember it now, unless some unusual circumstance of the meeting had burnt it into your memory. It is 40 years ago, and people don't remember nobodies over a stretch of time like that." I didn't wish to continue the conversation along that line, so I changed the subject. I could have proven to him without any trouble that we did meet in Washington in 1867, but I thought it might embarrass one or the other of us, so I didn't do it. I remember the incident very well. This was the way of it. I had just come back from the Quaker City excursion, and had made a contract with Bliss of Hartford to write The Innocents Abroad. I was out of money, and I went down to Washington to see if I could earn enough there to keep me in bread and butter while I should write the book. I came across William Clinton, brother of the astronomer, and together we invented a scheme for our mutual sustenance. We became the fathers and originators of what is a common feature in the newspaper world now, the syndicate. We became the old, original, first newspaper syndicate on the planet. It was on a small scale, but that is usual with untried new enterprises. We had 12 journals on our list. They were all weeklies, all obscure and poor, and all scattered far away among the back settlements. It was a proud thing for those little newspapers to have a Washington correspondence, and a fortunate thing for us that they felt in that way about it. Each of the 12 took 2 letters a week from us, at $1 per letter. Each of us wrote 1 letter per week and sent off 6 duplicates of it to these benefactors, thus acquiring $24 a week to live on, which was all we needed in our cheap and humble quarters. Clinton was one of the dearest and loveliest human beings I have ever known, and we led a charmed existence together, and a contentment which knew no bounds. Clinton was refined by nature and breeding. He was a gentleman by nature and breeding. He was highly educated. He was of a beautiful spirit. He was pure in heart and speech. He was a Scotchman and a Presbyterian of the old and genuine school, being honest and sincere in his religion, and loving it, and finding serenity and peace in it. He hadn't a vice, unless a large and grateful sympathy with Scotch whiskey may be called by that name. I didn't regard it as a vice, because he was a Scotchman, and Scotch whiskey to a Scotchman is as innocent as milk is to the rest of the human race. In Clinton's case, it was a virtue, and not an economical one. $24 a week would really have been riches to us if we hadn't had to support that jug. Because of the jug, we were always sailing pretty close to the wind, and any tardiness in the arrival of any part of our income was sure to cause us some inconvenience. I remember a time when a shortage occurred. We had to have $3, and we had to have it before the close of the day. I don't know how we happened to want all that money at one time. I only know we had to have it. Clinton told me to go out and find it, and he said he would also go out and see what he could do. He didn't seem to have any doubt that we would succeed, but I knew that was his religion working in him. I hadn't the same confidence. I hadn't any idea where to turn to raise all that bullion, and said so. I think he was ashamed of me, privately, because of my weak faith. He told me to give myself no uneasiness, no concern, and said in a simple, confident, and unquestioning way, "The Lord will provide." I saw that he fully believed the Lord would provide, but it seemed to me that if he had had my experience... But never mind that. Before he was done with me, his strong faith had had its influence, and I went forth from the place almost convinced that the Lord really would provide. I wandered around the streets for an hour, trying to think up some way to get that money, but nothing suggested itself. At last I lounged into the big lobby of the Abbott House, which was then a new hotel, and sat down. Presently a dog came loafing around. He paused, glanced up at me, and said with his eyes, "Are you friendly?" I answered with my eyes that I was. He gave his tail a grateful little wag, and came forward and rested his jaw on my knee, and lifted his brown eyes to my face in a winningly affectionate way. He was a lovely creature, as beautiful as a girl, and he was made all of silk and velvet. I stroked his smooth brown head, and fondled his drooping ears, and we were a pair of lovers right away. Pretty soon Brigadier General Miles, the hero of the land, came strolling by in his blue and gold splendors, with everybody's admiring gaze upon him. He saw the dog and stopped, and there was a light in his eye which showed that he had a warm place in his heart for dogs like this gracious creature. Then he came forward and patted the dog and said, "He is very fine. He is a wonder. Would you sell him?" I was greatly moved. It seemed a marvelous thing to me, the way Clinton's prediction had come true. I said, "Yes." The general said,
What do you ask for him?"
$3. The general was manifestly surprised. He said,
$3? Only $3? Why, that dog is a most uncommon dog. He can't possibly be worth less than 50. If he were mine, I wouldn't take 100 for him. I am afraid you are not aware of his value. Reconsider your price if you like. I don't wish to wrong you."
But if he had known me, he would have known that I was no more capable of wronging him than he was of wronging me. I responded with the same quiet decision as before. "No, $3. That is his price."
"Very well, since you insist upon it," said the general,
and he gave me $3 and led the dog away and disappeared upstairs. In about 10 minutes, a gentle-faced, middle-aged gentleman came along and began to look around here and there and under tables and everywhere, and I said to him, "Is it a dog you were looking for?" His face was sad before and troubled, but it lit up gladly now, and he answered,
"Yes, have you seen him?"
"Yes," I said, "he was here a minute ago, and I saw him follow a gentleman away. I think I could find him for you if you would like me to try." I have seldom seen a person look so grateful, and there was gratitude in his voice, too, when he conceded that he would like me to try. I said I would do it with great pleasure, but that as it might take a little time, I hoped he would not mind paying me something for my trouble. He said he would do it most gladly, repeating that phrase, most gladly, and asked me how much. I said, $3. He looked surprised and said,
"Dear me, it is nothing. I will pay you 10, quite willingly."
But I said, "No, 3 is the price," and I started for the stairs without waiting for any further argument. For Clinton had said that that was the amount that the Lord would provide, and it seemed to me it would be sacrilegious to take a penny more than what was promised. I got the number of the general's room from the office clerk as I passed by his wicket, and when I reached the room I found the general there caressing his dog, and quite happy. I said, "I'm sorry, but I have to take the dog again." He seemed very much surprised and said,
"Take him again? Why, he is my dog. You sold him to me, and at your own price."
"Yes," I said, "it is true, but I have to have him because the man wants him again."
"What man?"
"The man that owns him. He wasn't my dog." The general looked even more surprised than before, and for a moment he couldn't seem to find his voice. Then he said,
"Do you mean to tell me that you were selling another man's dog and knew it?"
"Yes, I knew that it wasn't my dog."
"Then why did you sell him?"
I said, "Well, that is a curious question you ask. I sold him because you wanted him. You offered to buy the dog. You can't deny that I was not anxious to sell him. I had not even thought of selling him, but it seemed to me that if it could be any accommodation to you—" He broke off in the middle and said,
"Accommodation to me? It is the most extraordinary spirit of accommodation I have ever heard of, the idea of your selling a dog that didn't belong to you."
I broke him off there and said, "There is no relevancy about this kind of argument. You said yourself that the dog was probably worth $100. I only asked you 3. Was there anything unfair about that? You offered to pay more. You know you did. I only asked you 3. You can't deny it."
"Oh, what in the world has that to do with it? The crux of the matter is that you didn't own the dog. Can't you see that? You seem to think that there is no impropriety in selling property that isn't yours." "Provided you sell it cheap. Now then,"
I said, "please don't argue about it any more. You can't get around the fact that the price was perfectly fair, perfectly reasonable, considering that I didn't own the dog, and so arguing about it is only a waste of words. I have to have him back again because the man wants him. Don't you see that I haven't any choice in the matter? Put yourself in my place. Suppose you had sold the dog that didn't belong to you. Suppose you—"
"Oh," he said, "don't muddle my brains with any more of your idiotic reasonings. Take him along and give me a rest."
So I paid back the $3 and led the dog downstairs and passed him over to his owner and collected $3 for my trouble. I went away then with a good conscience because I had acted honorably. I never could have used the 3 that I sold the dog for because it was not rightly my own. but the 3 I got for restoring him to his rightful owner was righteously and properly mine, because I had earned it. That man might never have gotten that dog back at all if it hadn't been for me. My principles have remained to this day what they were then. I was always honest. I know I can never be otherwise. It is as I said in the beginning. I was never able to persuade myself to use money which I had acquired in questionable ways. Now then, that is the tale. Some of it is true. Mark Twain.